Yesterday we got up to 41b in the art scroll, 41b1. But the last thing that we said was we quoted an argument between Rav and Shmuel, where Rav said that the only thing you have a right to do is to, if you want to cool off some of the chill, and that which the rabbis in the Mishnah permitted to place into the hot kettle cold water, a lot of cold water, right? You have this hot kettle, it's taken off the fire, but it's still boiling hot. And the Mishnah allowed you to put um, cold water, a lot of cold water into that tea kettle. Because if you put a little bit of cold water, then you're going to be cooking the small amount of cold water. But if you put a lot of cold water, that will overpower the hot water that's in the kettle. And therefore you would be able to go ahead and do that because you're not cooking the cold water. And he said, but if the Gemara understood, but if you remove all the contents of the hot pot, and now you have an empty pot that's just boiling hot, sizzling pot with no water in it, so you can't put even a large amount of water in it because the large amount of water will strengthen the steel, and therefore you can't do that. And Shmuel said that you can even go ahead and even l'tzaref nami, even if you are going to strengthen the steel, you could go ahead and do it. Even if you're going to harden the steel, you could do it. You could pour the water, the large amount of cold water into that empty pot. So the Gemara challenged that. How could you say you're allowed to, even if you don't have intent, if you want to say that if you're not intending to harden the steel, and it's not definite that you're going to harden the steel, and therefore you could put a lot of cold water into the empty pot, I can understand that. Because it's called Dover She'ein Mitchaven. You're not intending to harden the steel. It's not definite that you're going to harden the steel. So I can understand, you could tell me you could do that. But if you're actually intending to harden the steel, if you're intending to harden the steel, you can't do that. You can't intend to do a mulacha on Shabbat. So how could Shmuel say you could even go ahead and mitzaref? You could even go ahead and harden the steel. That was the Gemara's question yesterday. Therefore, the Gemara got up to a new point. The Gemara says, Ela iyitma. Ela means we're changing from what we understood before. Ela iyitma. This is the bottom of 41b1, the last paragraph, right? Ela iyitma hachima. This is what was said by Rav and Shmuel. Omar Rav stated, Lo shanu, that which the rabbis allowed to put cold water into a empty pot, right? That you're allowed to go ahead and put a lot of cold water. It's ella shir lahafshir. That's only if you placed an amount of cold water which would not have the ability, it would only have the ability to take the chill off the coldness off the cold water, but will not have but it does not have the amount of cold water, Moni Mori, that has the ability to harden the steel. And we said that when you have a pot of hot water, and let's say generally you have a pot of hot water, and you empty the contents of the pot of the hot water. So let's say the pot of water went up was 3/4 full or 80% full. That 80% full that pot of water was, the steel that had the water in it, the 80% of the water that was against the walls of that pot, right? We have 20% of the pot that was without any liquid. It was empty, the top of the pot, right? The top of the pot, no liquid came to it. You left the top of the pot open. But you put liquid in 80% of the pot. So from the bottom to 80%, that part of the pot generally doesn't get so soft. Why does it get so soft? Because the heat is not as intense in the bottom 80% of the pot than the top 20% of the pot. Because the bottom 80% of the pot is the liquid was in the pot. So the liquid, which was cold liquid, so the heat that goes against the pot is distributed between the liquid and the walls of the pot. But the part of the pot from 80% of the pot to the top, right? So if this is the pot, right? If this is the pot, Adam, right? So here's the pot. The pot goes all the way till here, to the top of the computer. But the water only went up to here. So this part of the pot, now if I empty the contents of the pot, and if I pour water, cold water, against exactly up to the part of the pot that was cooked, right? The cooking only went up to here. I only cooked this amount of water. And I emptied the contents, but now I want to take, now the pot is still hot. I want to take cold water, and I want to take the chill off the cold water. I want to make that cold water warm, a little warm. Good morning, Asaf. Good morning, Asaf. So what did I do? I went and I poured water into this pot. So if I poured water only into the same amount of height that the pot had previously cooked up water, that will not, if I pour water there, it will not harden the steel. Because the steel does not need to become hard from the bottom to the 80% where it originally had water. Because the heat is not so intense that it's going to actually soften the walls of the pot so much. But remember, I only cooked originally used 80% of the pot. So that from the top, above the line where I cooked, is 20% of the pot. There was no water, but I did not boil up any water. That is the hottest part of the pot. When I empty the contents of the hot water in the pot, if I touch the walls, wherever the water was in the pot beforehand, when I cooked the water, that part of the steel is not so soft. You know which part of the steel becomes very soft? The top 20% that had no water in it. Right? Imagine what happens if you take a pot, an empty pot, and you put an empty pot on a fire. That fire will be very intense and really would soften the walls of that pot because it's an empty pot. So just the heat of the fire going against the empty walls of the pot. So here I had a pot that was 80% full. But the top 20%, I did not cook in it because there was no water in that top 20%. So the fire was just going intensely against that 20% top of the pot. Is that clear? And therefore, if now that I emptied out the contents of the pot, if I want to now cool off different cold water, if I only put the water into the first 80% of the pot that was used for the cooking before, that water will not be strengthening the steel because the steel does not need strengthening of the first 80% that was used for the cooking. But if I put in, good morning, Ezra, if I put in enough water all the way to fill up the whole pot, that means I'm even hitting areas of the pot that was not used before for the cooking. And those areas are going to be soft, and those areas will need the hardening of the steel. Therefore, I am violating Shabbat if I want to put in a large amount of water, fill it up all the way to the top, even though I'm not cooking the water because I put so much water into this hot pot, it won't cook the water, but it will harden the pot on the top. Therefore, I would be in violation, according to Rav, because he would hold like Rabbi Yehuda, that even if you don't have intention to do the act of the malacha, you're not intending to, um, you didn't plan on hardening the pot, but at the end of the day, your action of pouring water, cold water, to the whole pot, from the bottom, top to the bottom, bottom to the top, has the ability to harden the steel, and you might be violating the Shabbat. Therefore, he says, Rav says you can't do that. However, Shmuel says, Afilu shil tzaref. Even you're allowed to go ahead and put a large amount of water, fill it all the way up to the top of this pot that was previously used for cooking water. Even though that pot only filled originally to 80%, you could subsequently take a large amount of water and fill the whole pot from the bottom to the top. And now you can answer me the question, but Rabbi, aren't you going to be hardening the steel on the top? So why does he allow it? The answer is because you're not intending to harden the steel on the top. Your intention is to take off the chill of the water that you're putting in. And it's not definite that you're actually going to be hardening the top. It's not definite that the top that was not used previously for cooking, the top of the pot, actually the steel needs hardening. It's possible it does need the hardening, possible it doesn't need the hardening. Even though there was no water originally used in that top 20% in the previous cooking, not necessarily all the time the steel becomes so soft that it actually needs hardening. Therefore, Shmuel holds, he's not intending to do it, not intending to harden the steel, and therefore you can go ahead and do it. Good morning, Simon. So now, therefore he says, Afilu shil tzaref mutar. It would even be permitted, even if you put a large amount of water. Okay, Simon, we are on Mem Beis Amud Aleph. 42a, we got to the new page. Mazel Tov Mabruk. So now the Gemara has the following question. Lememra, are you going to say the Shmuel ki Rabbi Shimon's really? Now you want to line up, as my father-in-law, Rabbi London of blessed memory, you'd say, line up the men, right? Line up the different rabbis. Who is which rabbi is holding like which rabbi? So the Memra, you mean to say the Shmuel ki Rabbi Shimon's relay? Are you telling me that Shmuel's opinion of allowance, right? Just to bring us up to date, we are on 42a. That Shmuel's opinion of allowing you to pour a large amount of water, of cold water, into a pot that you just poured out the boiling hot contents of water. You just poured out that water. And Shmuel says you could put water all the way, cold water, all the way up to the top of that pot. It's not going to get cooked because you're putting a lot of water, pouring a lot of water at one time. And the fact is you're not intending to harden the steel by putting that cold water in. You want to put the cold water in because you just want to take off the chill of the water. You want to make it a little bit lukewarm. It will not be able to cook the water. You're not intending to harden the steel, even though it might harden the steel, since you're not intending to do it, like we said yesterday. If you want to drag a bed or a chair outside in the backyard on Shabbat, you might make a groove in the ground and you might not. It's not definite, and you're not intending to make the groove. You're intending to just move the bed or the chair from place A to place B. So we say it's permitted on Shabbat if you're not intending. So that's what the Gemara says. But the Gemara says, but we have another law, and the Gemara is going to connect the following law to this law. Shmuel said, Mechabin gachalat shel matechet. You could extinguish if there is a coal a piece of, let's say, metal, let's say that was left over, you were forming metals, making into utensils. You fire the blacksmith, put his fire on the metal to carve it out, to shape it a certain way. You had a little piece of that hot metal that was left over. It was heated up. It's all red. It was heated up. You have a piece of that, but the problem is it was bishut rabim. It was on the floor in public property, and it's Shabbat. What do you do? It's There is some sort of, you want to protect society, and it's, let's say it's not a danger of life, let's say, but it's still something that could cause some harm. So if it says, Shmuel says, you could go ahead and you could actually extinguish on Shabbat that fire of that coal, right? Even though, I'm going to get up the Shulchan Aruch, even though you're not allowed to extinguish a fire on Shabbat, right? You can't go ahead and blow the candles out. The Shabbat candles, you want to go to sleep Friday night, and the Shabbat candles are on. You want to go to sleep Friday night, and the menorah of Hanukkah is lit. You can't blow out the candles on Shabbat. You can't blow out the candles on. And he says, now, I don't think there's a real danger of life keeping candles on if you put nice protection around the candles. And you put, that's why we have like a nice metal tray that we keep the candles on for Shabbat. Generally speaking, that's just, I presume, because if a candle will ever fall down, you have that you have that protection, right? And menorahs are pretty good also. You protect them. Or generally, there's not a problem. Um, if you put a menorah near curtains, that's a problem. You know what I'm saying? You light candles near a curtain, that's very irresponsible of somebody. These are the type of situations there where I think people have problems sometimes. Um, so in the Shulchan Aruch, he says, if you have a coal, Simeshin Lamed Sif Chav Zayin, if you have a coal that's placed in a place where many people could get damaged, like in public property, um, you could go ahead and extinguish it. The Chafetz Chaim says that's talking about, now there is an issue of mokseh on Shabbat, but if it's a question of moving a coal or extinguishing the coal, it would be better to move it. And we're talking about in a place, he says there's no way to move it. We're not talking about a place of issue of Rishut Rabim carrying in a public. Let's say there's no issue. Let's say there's an Eruv. There's no issue of carrying. Chafetz Chaim said then it would be better to move it to a place where people are not hanging out. But that would be better than actually extinguishing it. Um, and you could go ahead and extinguish it. And the Shulchan Aruch first says whether it's made out of metal or whether it's made out of wood. And we're going to see, and we're going to see about this. And he says whether it's metal or wood. And the Rambam says you can't, if it's made out of wood, you can't extinguish it. The Chafetz Chaim says the law follows not the Rambam. The law follows the more lenient opinion that even doesn't make a difference what the coal is made out of, wood or metal, you're allowed to on the Shabbat when you're allowed to go ahead and extinguish it to protect. Now, obviously, if you have a Gentile that could take care of it, I would say get a Gentile to deal with it. Don't extinguish it yourself. Um, we'll see. We're going to see maybe we'll see a little bit more understanding of this halacha. Now, on Shabbat, we've been learning the big. We're getting into big ideas of Shabbat. We spoke about the idea of doing an act when you're not intending to do the labor act. You're not intending to violate the Shabbat, and it's not definite you're going to violate the Shabbat. So we saw there is a argument whether you could do that or not. And this position of Shmuel is holding that you could do an act when it's not definite you're violating the Shabbat, and you're not intending to do the act of work, right? That's our case of the Gemara. You are pouring cold water into this hot pot, this empty hot pot. You're pouring a lot of cold water. You're not intending to strengthen the steel. You might be strengthening the steel. You might not, but you're not intending. You're allowed to do that. Adam, is that clear? That was the leniency. Ezra, is that clear? That was the leniency, right? You could do an act on Shabbat. Think of the case of the bed or the chair. You can move the bed or the chair outside, even though it's a dirt floor outside. You can move it on Shabbat in your backyard, even though you might make a groove in the ground. You might not make a groove. You might make a groove. You're not intending to make a groove. You could do it, right? Simon, is that clear? Now, if I know I'm going to make a groove, it doesn't make a difference if I'm not intending to make the groove. I know I'm going to make a groove. I can't do it. I don't know that makes the groove. So it's over here. I don't know I'm hardening the steel. I might be hardening the steel by pouring a lot of cold water into this empty hot pot, and I'm putting a lot of cold water. I'm putting it from the bottom of the pot to the top of the pot, which top of the pot is where I might be hardening the steel because there was no water that was cooked in that top of the pot, and yet I could do it. So the Gemara says, but we have V'ama Shmuel. Shmuel says, Mechabin gachele shamat b'shirav. You could go ahead and you could extinguish a coal made out of metal, a metal coal that's on the Shabbat, if it's in public area. You want to protect the population, the public. But you can't extinguish a coal made out of wood. Now, what's the difference between a coal made out of wood and a coal made out of metal? So Rashi says, a coal made out of wood is a biblical prohibition because you're making, the idea of a extinguishing a fire does not apply to a coal that's made out of metal. It's not talking about something that's a metal thing that's glowing. That's not the case, because let's understand why not. When you let's say when you're extinguishing a fire, right? So let's see. The question is how we want to. He says the prohibition of extinguishing is only, let's say, a piece of let's say in the Mishkan. Let's say the type of act was you want to make coals to burn different things. You want to make stuff for the Mishkan. You make a coal, and that was and you make coals, and you make coals out of wood. You didn't make the coals out of metal, right? It happens to be you were working with metal, so you were left over. There was a piece of metal that remained on fire. That's not the normal type of coal. That's not the normal type of you see.
Because the metal doesn't catch on fire.
Metal doesn't catch it. Doesn't just the fire will eventually just go out. The wood you could if you go ahead and good morning Boker Tov Chodesh Tov, when you extinguish the flame from the piece of wood, you made it into a coal, and now you use it as a coal, and that is the case of, let's say, of extinguishing of extinguishing a fire. You created something. You created a coal. Okay, so and therefore that would be the biblical violation. But if you go ahead and you extinguish a metal, a piece of metal that's glowing, that's not, you didn't create something as a result of that. Of your extinguishing didn't create. You just close the metal from glowing. You didn't make anything, right? So, and let's say that's not, so let's say, so the extinguishing a metal coal is not, um, a piece of metal that's on fire is not, God bless you, is not the the type of, that's not called a violation of extinguishing. Okay, I mean, I think they might say a point over here, right? They said that so there's no biblical prohibition of extinguishing a metal that's glowing. The biblical prohibition is to make a coal. How do you make a coal? By blowing out the fire on the piece of wood, and now you made a coal. So therefore, he holds you could go ahead and only they'll allow you to push away the rabbinic prohibition of extinguishing a metal coal, but the rabbis gave a rabbinic prohibition, because if you're going to extinguish a metal thing that's on fire, you might come to extinguish and make it what extinguish a wooden thing that's on fire, right? So therefore, out of protection, the rabbis made a fence, but the rabbis pushed away their rabbinic fence. They broke their rabbinic fence, so to speak. They allowed you to extinguish the metal thing when there's an issue of possible danger for the public. If it's not that's where the rabbis, now I would presume that the public has other ways of dealing with, if it's a wooden coal, so people we have to just stand there, tell people to move away from there, whatever it is. It's not that person's going to have to, morning, Ronnie, that person's actually, the guy's going to die if you don't extinguish that wooden coal. So we're not going to allow you to extinguish that wooden coal. You can extinguish that metal coal, right? That's what the Gemara makes a distinction, and we see that's how the Rambam holds, and we see that the Shulchan Aruch is going to pass in different, or whatever. The first opinion Shulchan Aruch says you can even extinguish a wooden coal, right? But this Gemara, this opinion is saying Shmuel is saying you only could extinguish a metal coal. Okay, is that clear? So the Gemara says, if you think Savlak Reb Shimon, if Shmuel holds like Reb Shimon, that if you don't have intention to do the act of work, you're allowed to do that on Shabbat, like you're not intending to harden the steel. That's why you could go ahead and pour cold water, a lot of cold water from the bottom to the top. So I feel a shalei nami, even if it's made out of wood. Meaning, if you hold like Rav Shimon, that's something that you don't have. When you don't have intention to do the act of working, you could do it, not intending to do a violation of Shabbat. As long as it's not definite you're going to violate the Shabbat, you could do it. So he should also agree to a wooden coal, because Reb Shimon holds that Reb Shimon holds the following. Listen to this. If I do an act of labor on Shabbat, I'm intending to do the act that is the prohibited act. I am intending to go ahead and I'm intending to extinguish a coal, right? The malacha is extinguishing, but I'm not extinguishing the coal for the purpose, for the creative purpose that is generally done. When you extinguish a coal, generally you extinguish the coal for the purpose of what? Extinguish the wood to make the coal, right? But here I'm not doing it for that purpose. You know why I'm extinguishing the wood? I don't want people to get hurt. Let's say on Shabbat, you're not allowed to carry, let's say, from private property to public property. And generally, the reason why one you can't carry because I want the item, I want an item that's here in my house. I want it in the street. So I want to be creative to do. I want this act. I need this act to get the item from here to the street. What about if there's a dead body in someone's house? Chas v'shalom. And it's not that they want the body there. They just don't want it here. They're not interested in getting it from here to there. So I'm not doing it for the purpose of the creativity. Would that be a biblical prohibition to carry the body from the private place to that other place when I'm not intending for that purpose? So, or let's say a guy digs a hole on Shabbat in the ground and he loosens up the soil, but he's not intending for the purpose of loosening the soil. He just needs the dirt. So he takes out dirt from the ground. He loosens the soil, but he's not doing it for the creative purpose of, it's true. He actually went ahead and he softened the ground, but that's not the intent. It wasn't needed. He didn't do it for that purpose. So the fact that it was created, but it wasn't needed for that purpose, would there be a biblical prohibition of the act if you do an act, a labor on Shabbat, but not with the intended purpose of that act? So here, the Gemara says, Shmuel holds, or Rav Shimon holds, if you do an act on Shabbat, not for its creative purpose, but for some other reason, you don't violate the Shabbat on a Torah level. So according to Rav Shimon, if you would go ahead, if you would go ahead and take a coal, even though it's wood, and you extinguish the wood, and now you created a coal, but that's not your intent. You didn't need to that. That wasn't why you did it. You did it for some other purpose. You did it because you just wanted the fire to go out. You don't want people to get hurt. Is that also subject to the biblical prohibition? So the Gemara is saying, Rav Shimon says there's no biblical prohibition over there. So the Gemara is asking, if you hold, like Rav Shimon, that you could do something without intent, as long as you're not intending. So if you hold like Rav Shimon, so the Gemara is thinking he also holds like Rav Shimon regarding doing an act of labor with the intent of doing the act, but not for its creative purpose. So therefore, why is he saying, if that's the case, why is Shmuel only allowing you to extinguish a metal coal? You should be able to extinguish a wooden coal, because a wooden coal would also be rabbinic when your purpose is not to create something, just to remove the damage, remove the possibility of someone getting damaged. So therefore, that's what the Gemara wants to understand. Why would Shmuel only be limit the allowance to a metal coal and not a wooden coal? We'll see more tomorrow about this. We got into a new subject. Have a great day, everybody. Chodesh Tov. Don't forget, Ya'aleh v'yavo. To be a beautiful month, Mishenichas Adar, Marbim b'simcha.